Welcome back, guys. In this episode we are going to continue to build our full stack application with Gin and Vue.js. So let's start off by making a couple of changes to our Gin backend. And the first change I want to do is in the Docker Compose file. I want to replace this IP address with localhost. And why is that? Well, I did some testing and I discovered that if I use the loopback IP address instead of localhost, traffic apparently doesn't see the Go backend and the frontend on the same network, and I get some coarse policy exchange error. So we're going to fix that by using localhost. The second thing I want to do is in the transaction.go file, I want to replace ID with small letters because I want to have our JSON types consistent. And the last thing I discovered while building our front end is that I actually need one more endpoint. As you can see right here, I have a get route that gets all of the transactions, but I also want to have a get by ID transaction route. So we're going to come here and I'm going to go and add a new endpoint, and this is going to be this endpoint right here. As you can see right here, we are using a parameter in our pass, so if we use the colon, this is going to be a parameter and we're going to be able to grab this in our code. Now let's implement our find transaction by ID method. Now this method is very simple, very similar to find all transactions, and we are basically going to call the transaction service find by ID controller method, and we're going to pass the request context as well as the parameter. So next let's go into transaction service, and of course we have to add one more method here. So first let's go and add the find by ID method, which is going to take an ID and return an entity transaction, and let's add the find by ID method. So right here you can see right here we are converting the string into a int, and we are going to call the repository find by ID method. Very simple, we've done this a couple of times before, so let's grab the code and look at this method. So find all, and I'm going to add a find by ID method. So let's take a look at this function. As you can see right here, we are creating a reference to a transaction and we are querying the database for a transaction with this ID. So as you can see right here, we are passing the context to the database. And why is that? Well, you saw me passing the context from one layer to another all the time, and this is because there are many benefits to using context all across layers. So let's say, for example, database doesn't respond in time, we can cancel the context here, and this context is going to be propagated to all the other layers, which is going to result in a graceful cancel. And of course, if we need to trace the flow of a request, we can look at the context. So now let's add the find by ID method in the interface, and let's say Docker Compose up. Now that Docker Compose is up and there are no errors, let's go and test our new API endpoint. So I'm going to get all the transactions, and let's say I want a transaction with ID 2. So let's write /2 and we get a transaction. If we want to get the third one, we get the third one. Very nice. Let's go ahead and build now our front end. So let's start building the front end by creating the Vuejs container. We are going to have a Vue client service, and we are going to build from this directory, and we are going to expose these ports and enable traffic on this container. If we go down to volumes right here, if you are familiar with Vue, you know that it has hot reload. So basically when you change a file in the browser, we are going to get the updated version of the application. Now what is very interesting and what I'm trying to do right here is to get that functionality working, but because of the ways Windows writes to file, well, this is actually not going to work. If you're on Linux, you're going to get hot reload. Unfortunately, on Windows, you're going to type docker compose down and docker compose up, build again. Now let's create our Vue app. So let's clear the terminal and run this command. Of course, I'm going to change my project to source client, and I'm going to use Vue with TypeScript. Great. Let's jump into the directory and let's install our dependencies. We're going to start off using Tailwind. Great, now let's initialize it. And let's go into the tailwind config.js and replace this with this. Now let's go to the styles and replace all of this with the tailwind. Now let's install the other dependencies. We're going to install the Vue router, so npm install Vue router, and we're going to install Axios. We're going to use Axios to interact with our APIs. Now let's go ahead and build a Docker file for this container, so new Docker file. And let's write down the configuration. We're going to pull node, and we're going to add to the path the bin folder in the node modules, because Vue needs some of these executables in order to work. We're going to copy the packages, the two package files, and we're going to run npm install. Then we're going to add our files, and we're going to run npm run dev with -- host, because we want to expose the Docker network to our local area network. Now let's go ahead and clean the application. So we're going to first go into the tsconfig file, and here I want to add some compiler options regarding the path. Next, let's look at the components. Let's delete this component, and let's delete everything here. Going in the main.ts file, we're going to use a router, so we have to change this a bit. We're basically going to create an app, and we're also going to use the router and then mount the app. So let's now create the router directory, and here we're going to create a index.ts file. I hope you're familiar with Vue, because we're going to scaffold a application pretty quickly, and I'm not going to go over everything in detail. This isn't going to be a beginner tutorial. But in this file, we're basically going to create 3 routes. One to our dashboard, one where we're going to create the transaction, and one where we're going to edit them. And each of these paths is going to have a component to its name. Great, now let's go in app.vue, and here I'm going to bring in some code. So this probably looks familiar if you used Vue before. We are going to have 3 sections. One with the script tag, we're going to write our TypeScript. One template tag where we're going to write our HTML, and one style tag where we're going to write the CSS. But since we're using Tailwind, we're not really going to be using the styles. So as you can see right here, this is very simple. We only have one route to the dashboard and some HTML and some CSS. Now let's start building the dashboard. But before we do that, let's comment out some of these lines of code so we don't get any errors. And let's build the dashboard component. So dashboard.vue, and here I'm going just to paste some HTML. And let's take a look at it in the browser. So let's build the application first. So we have the transactions table, and now we need some code to pull the transactions from the API. First I want to mention this router link. This is basically the equivalent of an anchor in Vuejs, and as we can see, this redirects us to /transaction/create. So let's add the script tags, and here we're basically going to create a interface transaction which is going to match our transaction interface in the Golang application, as you can see right here. And next we're going to export a default component, and we're going to name it dashboard, and we're going to create some data. We're going to create a slice of transactions, and we're going to call a mounted function. And this mounted method, basically when this page is first loaded, is going to run the code within it, and we're going to call the get transactions method. And in this get transactions method, we're basically going to do a call for Axios, but first let's fix some of the imports. So let's add import from Axios, and let's add import from define component. Great. So as you can see right here, we're going to call localhost/API/txn, and we are going to add the response to our data we created up here. If there are any errors, we're going to console log them. Now let's take a look in the browser. And apparently I missed a parenthesis. Great. So now in the browser, if we look into the DevTools, we are going to see the two transactions from our database. Great. Now let's write some code so we can actually see the transactions on our website. So we have a table with a head with those columns, and we're going to add a body with our information. And in this body, if the transactions actually are pulled successfully from the API, we're going to loop over the transactions, and we are going to display the information about each transaction. Of course, we're also going to add two buttons, one which is going to redirect us to our edit component, and one that is going to delete our transaction. So as you can see right here, we are concatenating the ID in our path to the edit component. And now we're also going to write the code to delete a transaction. But first, if you remembered, I said right here if the transactions actually have been successfully pulled from the database, we are going to display them. Otherwise, we're going to just display a loading message. Okay, now let's scroll down and add the delete transaction method. This method is going to take a student ID number, and we're going to ask the user, are you sure you want to delete the transaction? And we are going to call Axios. And this is very interesting right here. I discovered while working with Axios that actually there is no built-in feature to write a body when you call a delete method. So we have to write this workaround, right? We have to use this data right here, and data is going to allow us to write a body as well as the headers. And we're going to pass to our API the ID. We're going to then get the transactions again after we deleted that transaction, and here we're going to handle the errors, right? So if there was an error, we're just going to write an alert message. Back in the browser, we're going to So now if we go into the browser and go to localhost, we can see that the transactions have successfully loaded. And if we try to delete a transaction, we are asked, are you sure? And we click OK, deleted successfully, and the transaction is now gone. So now back into the code, we are going first to go into the index.html, and I want to replace the title with portfolio tracker. And next, let's go ahead and build the transaction create component. Make sure you uncomment the transaction create lines into the router, and go ahead and create a new file, transaction create.vue, and here I'm just going to paste in some code. So we're going to import Axios, of course, but I want to define our data first. So we're going to have an error, and we're going to have a model, and this model reassembles basically the request to our create API. And I'm going to add the template first. So I know this looks kind of scary and big, but it's quite simple actually. We have a form right here, and in this form we're going to display if there are any errors. We're going to see in a bit how this is handled, but if there aren't any errors, we're going to have a form, and in this form is going to have some input fields, and each input field is going to be binded to our data we defined down below using the V model, right? So we have all these fields right here, and we have a button with the method save transaction. And let's take a look at this method, right? So let's paste the code, and we are going to look at the save transaction method. We can see right here we're making a post request to our API, and we're going to send a body, and in this body we're going to add manually the fields. So the type field in our request is going to be this model transaction.type, and we can see right here for the volume and the price we are converting these two values into numbers, because as you remember probably, our API endpoint in Golang expects a number. So after that we're going to take the response and console log it. We're going to reset our data, and then we're going to redirect the user to the dashboard. If there are any errors, we're going to display them into the form. So we're basically getting the error from the response, and we're putting it in this .error variable, and we are displaying this up right here. Now if you're a front-end developer and this number conversion looks kinda ugly to you, you should know that this is actually an afterthought. If we go into the controller right here, you're going to see that we're binding the data using this function. Now if I was to actually not use the number cast into the front end, I would actually have to write my own unmarshal JSON function to bind the data to this entity.transaction, which was actually an afterthought and quite so I decided I'm going to just cast it right here. Now if we go down here and this cast looks kinda ugly to you as a front-end developer, you should know this is actually an afterthought. When we first wrote the API, if you remember, we used this should bind JSON to bind it to the entity.transaction, which is actually expected a number. So in order to avoid writing the cast in the front end, you would actually have to write your own function, your own unmarshal JSON function. And as I said, this is an afterthought, this is more of a workaround. I do recommend you write your own function, but this works too for our case. Back into the browser, let's go and try to add a transaction. We've got this form right here. So let's say we want to buy some ASML, for example, and we're going to buy 2 shares, the price of 800, and we're going to buy it on this date. Okay, see right here we have successfully added a transaction. Now let's see what happens when we put some bad input. So let's say I want to buy this amount of ASML, right? We're going to put some random values in. As you can see right here, we get the error, right? So it works as expected. Finally, the last thing we have to do is actually create the edit component. So first let's uncomment this code. And now let's go and create the edit component. Now the HTML is literally going to be the same. The only difference is going to say, instead of add transaction, it's going to say edit transaction. But now let's go into the script tag, and here we're going to define the data. So add the script tag, create our component, and as you can see right here, the data is almost the same as in the case of the transaction create. The only difference is that now we actually have the ID here, because as you remember, our API also expects the ID when we try to edit a component. Next, let's look at the mounted function, and here we're going to call a get transaction data function, and we're going to pass in the param from the route, which is basically the transaction ID. And what we're basically doing here, you know, when you try to edit something, it's already filled with the current information. That's what we're trying to do right here. Next, let's look at the methods, right? So the get transaction data method, if we come right here, is just a call to Axios, and it's a call to our new API we just created in this episode, and the result, we're going to copy the information from the result into the model transaction. And now let's look at the edit transaction method, which is very similar to the create one. We are calling the API and we are passing into its body the model.transaction. Again, we are using this cast right here. I already explained why. And we are again resetting after we get the information. We are basically resetting the data, and we are redirecting the user to the dashboard. If there are any errors, again, we're going to display them just like in the transaction create. And now actually there's an error apparently, and there's an extra parenthesis right here. So let's take a look at the code once again. Basically, when we get to this page, we get the data in our model, and the model is binded to the form. So the fields of the form are actually going to be populated with data. We're going to change that data, and we're going to submit it to the edit transaction function. Now let's jump into the browser. Back into the browser, if we visit localhost and we try to edit a transaction, for example this one, I'm going to say that the price is actually 785.18, and try to save, we can see that the transaction has been modified. Well done, you just made it through this tutorial. If you've gotten so far, might as well hit the like and subscribe button. I'm going to try to leave any useful links down into the description. Have a nice day.